During this time, most of the Europeans had monarchs because being ruled over is just awesome. Monarchs were becoming increasingly secular during this time, though. The Enlightenment impacted the political development in Europe. What a surprise that a major change in ideals would affect monarchs, too. They believed in natural rights, which are rights that each person possesses. Our very own Declaration of Independence, written by old TJ, voiced these same ideals. Good thing no one stole it like Nicolas Cage in National Treasure. Most people need an enlightened ruler to steer them in the right direction. They had to tolerate other religions, freedom of speech and press, and the right to hold private property. They must also foster the arts. France's economy got better, but they resisted reform, even as the aristocracy grew stronger. Like we good and reform bad. France had bad rulers during this period, which led to their revolution later on. Britain didn't actually have absolutism because of their glorious revolution. The Hanoverian dynasty ruled Britain after the Stuarts. First ruler, George I, didn't even speak English. Like, how do you rule an English-speaking country, like England, without even speaking the language of your country? After a century of prosperity, the Dutch economy experienced a decline. Oligarchies dominated everything as they governed the towns. Prussia intervened, which shows how central states were powerful. Of the 5 major European states, 3 were located in Central and Eastern Europe. Prussia had a huge army and bureaucracy. This was their backbone, because without it, they would have been like Jello. King Frederick William asserted, "One must serve the king with life and limb, with good and chattels, with honor and conscience, and to surrender everything except salvation. The latter is reserved for God, but everything else must be mine." Prussia had a rigid class system that persisted since the 17th century. The Junkers dominated Prussia because they had large estates with lots of serfs. Despite their name, there's no proof that they had an interest in junk. Frederick II came to power very well versed in enlightened thought and invited Voltaire to live in his court for a few years. He tried to reform some parts but wouldn't give up serfdom. He didn't want to lose the support of the aristocracy. He increased the army size and didn't hesitate to use it. He would see someone struggling and be like, "Yo, let's go take their land," because they fighting. The Austrian Empire, the Habsburgs, had become one of the great European states by the beginning of the 18th century. They had a lot of different cultures and languages throughout the empire, which made common laws almost impossible to make. Joseph II differed from his mother, Maria Theresa, and wanted to have widespread reforms. He abolished serfdom and the death penalty, and established the principle of equality before the law. He introduced complete religious toleration and restrictions on the Catholic Church. He overwhelmed Austria by alienating the nobility by freeing the serfs, and alienated the church by attacking the establishment. His successors undid most of his reforms. Imagine telling a group of people some rules, and then as soon as you're 6 feet under, they change all the rules back. That's what happened with Joseph II. Catherine the Great ruled Russia after her husband kicked the bucket. She was familiar with the philosophers and wanted to reform Russia along the lines of the Enlightenment. At first she was like, "Reform!" She tried to make a new law code after she called for an election of the assembly. Catherine questions the institutions of serfdom, torture, and capital punishment. After a year and a half, she realized this really wasn't working.
On the topic of diplomacy and wars, during these times the armies of the nations in Europe began to increase their militaries in size. Now, imagine the horror the taxpayers had to go through when filling out their W-2s, but we'll talk about that later. You think with these bigger armies that there would be even more destruction, right?
Wrong!
Generals finally decided not to send their troops on suicide missions, which was more destructive. They sought victory through tactics, not through glory or attrition. Sun Tzu would approve of this. And this is less destructive. The use of private armies and military conscription helped increase the size of these armies. Now, on the topic of economic expansion and social change, things would change for the better, so it seemed. The population of Europe increased thanks to the decreased death rate and plentiful food. Europe experienced an agricultural revolution thanks to the crops of the Native Americans and other North American tribes. The idea that the family as a whole was more important than one family member's individual wants arose. Also, the idea that the eldest son would receive the parents' estate began to be put into practice. This was called primogeniture. For couples and families that were poor and could not afford or straight up didn't want a child, infanticide was practiced. Moving on to economic change, joint stock trading companies began to expand along with merchant empires. During this time around the 1700s, England began to use paper notes or bills. Entrepreneurs sold product and then used their revenue as capital for their business in order to expand it even more. These cottage industries would increase, which would increase trade, which in turn would increase prosperity. Now, with all the change in warfare and new economic prosperity, you think that all the classes would be doing pretty good, right?
Wrong.
Now, what would you have done if the man gave you no voice or options but to pay these taxes without any representation whatsoever? Revolution. Now, the thing is that the majority of Europe were the poor, 85% to be exact, who of which could barely afford a loaf of bread, while the other 15% lived in absolute luxury. This statistic would later prompt an uprising in France, known as the French Revolution.
During the 18th century, the societal norm was very much the same as it was in the Middle Ages, as far as class, rights of marriage, and land ownership. Society was split between the peasants, the nobility, and the clergy. Peasants made up around 85% of the population. These were further broken down into serfs and free peasants. The free peasants owned small amounts of land on which they lived. The serfs, however, were not free and were in turn sold as part of the property and were near slaves to the lord of the land they lived on. The other percent of the population was made up of the clergy, the members of the church who preached and worked for the Pope. The middle class, who was small and made up of merchants and shop owners, and worked as other small tasks that would have earned them somewhat reasonable amount of coin, and with the ability to live slightly more lavishly than the peasants, who had to work with little pay and no free time. Last of the societal structure was the nobility, the wealthy top. These aristocrats made up only 2 to 3% of the population, but had the most control, for being of nobility granted you with many privileges, such as exclusion from many of the more terrible forms of punishment, as well as the nobles were often afforded positions of leadership in the army as officers. The ownership of serfs was common amongst the nobles, for it provided a veritably free source of labor, and in many cases you held absolute power over your serfs, controlling who they married, their children, and in some cases, such as Poland, held the power of life or death. This was a societal norm for many hundreds of years. However, with the Age of Enlightenment and the studies of ancient Greek and Roman writings on science and philosophy, these enlightened thinkers disapproved highly on the subject of owning a man completely and with no restrictions. However, this way of an organized society had been around for so many years, it would take time before it changed.